In a powerful show of support for nature, nearly every government in the world united behind the CBD's sweeping biodiversity plan for life on Earth. They committed to halting the extinction of threatened animal, plant, and fungi species. And in an historic first, they also committed to helping those species recover, so that the life we share our planet with can not only survive, but thrive. Making these goals a reality will take all of us working together. Reverse the Red is supporting governments, conservation experts, and communities around the world as they join forces to activate tried and tested tools and tie global efforts to local expertise. All in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can secure our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our special webinar on the Conflict to Coexistence approach in theory and practice. Thanks to our friends at WWF for joining us to share more about this approach and framework and some case studies as well. I'm Megan Joyce. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Coordinator for Reverse the Red, and I just want to also thank our Governing Council. We are an action partnership co-chaired by the IUCN Species Survival Commission and the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, alongside other Governing Council members, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, Rewild, the Toronto Zoo, and the Zoological Society of London. Also, a quick shout out and thank you to all of our annual financial supporters. These folks and their organizations are really dedicated to species recovery and make all of our work at Reverse the Red, as well as all of our webinars, possible. So we're really happy to have them on board as well. A couple of housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our WWF team. You should have the ability to show captions and translations at the bottom of your Zoom. So if you would like to do that, there's a button there. And as we go through, please add your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom as well. We will have time at the end for discussion, and we'd love to answer all of your questions. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom as well. And we will record and we will be able to share the recording after. So in case you need to leave or in case you've missed some of it and you are watching this in the future, thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, Nilanga, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan. It's an honor to be invited to present on the C2C approach today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nilanga Jaisingha. I'm with WWF. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I work with many colleagues across the world on the issue of human-wildlife conflict management and moving towards coexistence. And I'm here with my colleagues Femke and Kinley today to speak about this approach. So without further ado, we'll get going. Thank you, Femke, for moving the slides for us. So we, as you are aware, will be discussing this approach, C2C conflict coexistence. But before we go into that, I'd love to speak a little bit about the background of why we started moving towards this approach and why it's important to think about holistic and integrated approaches to managing human-wildlife conflict so that we can move towards coexistence. Next slide, please. So the issue of human-wildlife conflict, as all of you, I'm sure, are aware, is on the surface really interactions or negative interactions between people and wildlife. It can have negative impacts on people, their livelihoods, their property, for instance, but also in return can have negative impacts on wildlife as humans retaliate against wildlife for the damages that they're incurring as a result of human-wildlife conflict. But also beneath that, beneath the surface there is a lot of tension that occurs when human-wildlife conflict happens between people on how to manage this conflict. So there are social dynamics at play that need to be considered when we're thinking about human-wildlife conflict at large. But before that, I will share a statistic that is quite relevant in terms of why this is happening, is that we believe, based on a report we published in 2021 called The Future for All, The Need for Human-Wildlife Coexistence, that 56% of the Earth's surface, or terrestrial surface rather, is shared by humans and wildlife. With increasing habitat loss, with increasing interactions between humans and wildlife, this issue is only bound to increase over time as more overlaps occur across the world. And this includes the marine context as well. Next slide, please. So we mentioned the impacts on people in the previous slide. In addition to houses, property being damaged, people can lose their crops, livelihoods in terms of livestock and other types of income generating measures that can be impacted and destroyed by wildlife during these negative interactions that occur. And sometimes people are injured and killed as well as a result of these conflicts that occur. Next slide, please. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, wildlife are also significantly impacted in addition to the obvious retaliation where wildlife is killed. Here you'll see an elephant has been killed as a result of human-elephant conflict. There are also injuries that wildlife experience, but also other long-term repercussions in terms of increased potentially aggression that negative interactions create within wildlife, but also that then leads to increased negative interactions as well. Next slide, please. So Megan alluded to the CBD earlier as well in the Reverse the Red video. There are a lot of relevances to human-wildlife conflicts within various global frameworks. It is one of the most important, as we're seeing today, one of the most significant escalating and important issues in conservation as we see it, given increasing habitat loss, as I mentioned earlier, increasing interactions. The issue itself is relevant to a number of sustainable development goals. It is relevant to the CBD Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 4 specifically refers to human-wildlife conflict and moving towards coexistence. And also I wanted to highlight the IUCN SSC guideline on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence that is available right now for suggestions or guidelines on management as well. Next slide, please. So one key thing that I would like to highlight here is that there are a number of global challenges as it comes to managing human-wildlife conflict, but as we see for the longest time, a big challenge that we've kind of experienced or understood to be the case is that management has taken piecemeal approaches, meaning that often there's either a fence put in somewhere to prevent wildlife from getting into inhabited areas or crop fields or livestock, for instance, or there are compensation schemes in other places that support sort of buffering losses to human-wildlife conflict. But oftentimes, and this is by no means a generalization, some organizations have been doing more integrated approaches over time, but as a general rule, there have been a lot of piecemeal approaches done in history for managing human-wildlife conflict, and we believe that that is not fully effective in long-term management of conflict because it ultimately serves as a band-aid approach to what is happening right now. But there has to also be a focus on drivers. We've seen that there has been significant lack of focus on the drivers themselves that lead to or exacerbate human-wildlife conflict, such as habitat loss, unplanned development, various drivers that in turn either lead to or increase human-wildlife conflicts. Also, we've seen that there is unequal responsibility when it comes to managing this conflict. Often, it's either governments that are mandated with managing the conflict or NGOs largely that have been given the onus of managing this conflict, whereas everyone who is involved, either impacting or impacted by these human wildlife conflicts, should be involved in its management. So that leads to the fact that there has been a lack of stakeholder participation. So if not everyone is engaged in this management, there's going to be a lack of buy-in, there's a lack of investment, lack of engagement. Therefore, there will be a lot of gaps in stakeholder participation. But one of the key things also why we haven't been able to see results or effective management at scale is because of huge funding gaps to address this issue. It has only more recently become of interest to a lot of funding agencies as well as they're seeing the escalation of the issue globally. So we are starting to see funding opportunities come about to address this issue, but there is still a significant funding gap. Next slide, please. So here I would like to go over some terminology just for everyone's understanding in terms of how we view the term coexistence. Overall, when we speak of coexistence, there is the perception that everything is well, the conflict is managed very well, and that people are happy to live alongside wildlife. But in fact, we see coexistence as lying on a spectrum, especially when it comes to human-wildlife conflicts with large and dangerous wildlife, like bears, tigers, elephants. Oftentimes, even if the conflict is managed very well, there will always be some level of risk involved that the elephant perhaps can get past that fence or whatever measures that you have put in place, or a tiger can eventually get into your livestock pen, for instance, however well you are managing the conflict. So there's some level of risk involved. Because of that, we put that level of coexistence towards the lower end. There is coexistence. People are still willing to live alongside wildlife, but they also understand that there is some risk involved. But with other species where it's much easier to coexist, where conflict is managed well, people are happy to live alongside them, there is going to be a higher level of sort of coexistence that's going to occur in that situation. So I just wanted to highlight that the way we see it, coexistence itself is a nuanced, complex term, and that it does lie on a spectrum. Next slide, please. And all this is based on tolerance, or the ability and willingness of people to accept the actual or potential costs of living with wildlife. So tolerance is an important factor as we move towards coexistence in any given situation. Next slide, please. So now I would like to turn over to my colleague Femke to speak to the C2C conflict to coexistence approach. Femke, over to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had to stop sharing to activate my audio. So I will reshare the presentation and take it from there. Thank you, Nilanga, for this introduction. And I hope everyone can see the slides again.
Yes, that looks perfect.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so as Nilanga mentioned, we were seeing some issues in conflict management, and that was basically the starting point of the development of the Safe Systems approach in 2015 by the WWF Tigers Alive initiative, and we further developed it into the C2C conflict to coexistence approach, which is built on 4 pillars. So it is a holistic approach which considers the diversity of drivers and impacts to human-wildlife conflict. It's a participatory process involving all players and actors that are either impacted or are impacting the situation. It is inclusive, so mainly working with those who are heavily impacted, as I mentioned. And then also it is an approach that is connecting various management actions, which we would call an integrated approach. So at the core of the C2C approach are 4 outcomes where we want to move from conflict to coexistence. As Nilanga said, on the spectrum, we move from low tolerance and high risk. We want to move to a situation of higher tolerance and less risk, and focusing on these 4 outcomes there. So it is about people being able and willing to live alongside wildlife, their livelihoods and assets being secured against the presence of wildlife. Wildlife have given the ability to thrive alongside people, and their habitats sufficient to ensure sustainable wildlife populations. And so in order to achieving those 4 outcomes, a multitude of potential actions are identified and implemented of 6 human-wildlife conflict management elements. And so we say that these 6 elements together form the management approach for human-wildlife conflict. And a very important basic element is, of course, understanding the interactions in the given landscape, understanding what is happening, what are the drivers of conflict in this particular site. Then, obviously, governance structures and supportive or enabling policy environment for the implementation of conflict management approaches is vital. And this is also something that is considered in the C2C approach. Then there's the element of prevention. You could think of livestock fencing or crop protection through electric fences, for example, or any other type of prevention methods. Then we have the response element, which is about responding to conflict whenever it still occurs, despite effective prevention methods. The next element is on mitigation, which is focused on alleviating the costs and damage incurred by any conflict. So this could be through compensation schemes or insurance schemes, or sometimes other types of alternative livelihoods or income sources. And then the last one is on monitoring, which is about the monitoring of the incidents themselves, but also the effectiveness of any of the interventions that are considered in the site. So, as I said, the integrated implementation of actions of these 6 elements form the management system, the conflict management system. And the implementation of such a framework is based on tolerance and resilience. So as Nilanga also mentioned, there will always be a level of conflict. And so the aim of the C2C approach is to enhance the resilience of people, to live with wildlife, to increase their tolerance, and then also to making sure that the responsibility of those interventions is shared among stakeholders. And then, as mentioned before, holism is fundamental. It should not only be about the direct damages or things that we can see occurring, but also about the drivers of human-wildlife conflict. So that was a bit about the theory of the C2C approach. And now I will explain a bit more about the methodology, how people are implementing those elements, and how do they get to a human-wildlife conflict management approach based on those elements to achieve those 4 outcomes. So the first step in the approach is a context screening. So a small team, a sub-team, a designated team working together on this C2C approach in a landscape, conduct a context screening, understanding the ecological and socioeconomic elements of the site, of wildlife, understanding the main drivers of human-wildlife conflict, and basically anything that is related. And then this is followed by a stakeholder identification and analysis approach, where the main stakeholders are identified that are either impacted by conflict or could impact the situation, such as governments or organizations operating in the landscape. And then this is followed by the C2C assessment. And this is a standardized questionnaire that can be adapted to the local context. And it is basically an interview that is done with those identified stakeholders to understand where the main gaps are in the current conflict management approaches that are being implemented. So what we want to know there is, where are the gaps in terms of those 4 outcomes, and what interventions are already implemented of those 6 elements that I showed, and what is their effectiveness basically. And then based on this information captured in the C2C assessment, the co-design phase is started. That's the step number 4 in this cycle, which starts with the reporting of all of the findings to the stakeholders that are involved in this process, to discuss the gaps that were found and the most urgent things to be addressed. And then together, a human-wildlife conflict management strategy is being designed based on those gaps, and of course also based on the opportunities that may be present in the site to addressing human-wildlife conflict. And also what I wanted to mention is that this C2C assessment forms the baseline for the work on human-wildlife conflict, because it gives a very good understanding of where current gaps are, and you can go back to it after the implementation of conflict management interventions on the small and large scale, as number 5 and 6 here in the cycle. You can go back to them in the evaluation and understand how have we maybe moved some of these gaps? Have we maybe improved the situation, and where is more action needed? And this is also an important aspect for fundraising. We can very clearly show to potential donors which gaps we are addressing, what budgets are needed for which interventions, and we can show over time how effective these implementation or interventions may have been. So as you see here in the cycle, the cycle ends with the evaluation and capturing of lessons learned, and then it basically goes back to the first step. But over time, the focus will shift on the right side of the figure 8, because when we start with the context screening and the stakeholder identification, most of the time these things will remain roughly the same over time. And there will be a need to adapt the implementation of management interventions a bit more. But of course, once in a while, you can go back to those first 3 steps to review if there's any changes needed. Then a little bit more about the co-design phase. So that is the step 4 in the cycle. So why is that needed, and what are we doing there? The main reason is to assess where are we now with all the stakeholders, where do we want to be in the short, medium, and long term? How can we work together to get there? And also, how do we define success together? And so eventually what you want to do through such a co-design process is move towards a more common understanding of the interventions that you implement, find an agreement on the strategies, roles and responsibility, timelines and budgets, and then eventually also an agreement by stakeholders. So eventually it's also moving closer together, working together on a joint vision for human-wildlife conflict and towards coexistence in the particular site. So eventually this leads to the implementation of a multitude of interventions of those 6 elements that I showed. So they can be on prevention or on mitigation, on understanding the interaction, like some of the research pictures here, additional livelihoods, and all sorts of things to address conflict on the ground. So we started with a number of pilots. You can see the green circles here on the screen, and you will hear more from one of the pilots in Bhutan from my colleague Kinley a bit later. Currently, more than 10 WWF sites are implementing, and many others are in the phase of starting their implementation. But we are also working with external organizations. We don't want this to just be a WWF approach. Yes, WWF developed it, but we made it in such a way that it can be used by anyone. And so we published a paper on the theory and the the methodology of the approach, which you can find in the Conservation Science and Practice journal. And then we have a website where all of the materials can be found. We will put the link in the chat where you can access all the materials. So we created a guide, step-by-step guide to guide people through that figure 8. And also we developed an additional set of tools on things like doing a context screening or making a stakeholder analysis, or how do you capture the data using smart software, and anything that may be useful in implementing the approach. So now we will be hearing from our colleague Kinley about the implementation of one of the pilots in Bhutan, and we would love to hear also your questions and remarks afterwards. Thanks.
Give me 1 second. I forgot to put on my mic. Okay. Is my screen visible on the decks?
Yes, that
Slides.
looks great.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nilanga and Femke, giving the overview and setting the context here. And to introduce myself, my name is Kile Tenzin. I'm based in Bhutan. So today I'm here to share the experiences of C2C implementation in one of the landscape where conservation is not only about protecting wildlife, but also about protecting the people who live alongside the wildlife. This strategy covers 308 households across 5 villages, addressing the conflict involving 7 groups of wildlife species. And the key question as we progress would be like, how can people and wildlife share the same landscape more safely and sustainably? And Bhutan's forests are our national strengths, but they are also living and working alongside the landscapes. Shimgang, in particularly, it's a district that has almost 94% of the forest cover and supports exceptional wildlife diversity. At the same time, many rural families depend directly on the farming, livestock, and forest resources. Therefore, when wildlife damages crops, kills livestock, or threatens safety, conservation becomes a daily livelihood issue. So therefore, C2C here recognize that we cannot achieve lasting conservation unless communities also feel secure and supported. So here in the slides, you see a map. So it's a pilot site map where the name is called Trung, and it's a cluster of village where it is suitable for pilot because it brings together people, forests, and many conflict-prone species within one landscape. Its 3,371 residents share 358 square kilometers with key, wildlife species such as tiger, leopards, bear, dhole, ungulates, and primates. The management responsibility is also shared among the forest divisions and the protected areas that encompasses the entire landscape. This complexity makes strong challenging, but it also makes an exceptional pace to test an integrated coexistence approach. Our approach has been like a strategy was developed by stepwise step, as Femke rightly explained earlier. So here we first studied the landscape and the conflict contracts. Then we identified the institutions and the communities that needed to participate. Most importantly, we listed about 304 community members and co-designed the strategies with about 236 participants. This ensured that actions were not selected only, but technically backstop by the technical supports wherever we could have provided to the entire landscape team. And some of the findings and realities on the ground after the assessment, what it informed us was communities and duty bearers did not always identify the same priorities, as you see from the graphs itself. So communities, so if you look at the perception provided by the communities viewed the tiger as the greatest personal safety concerns, while service providers highlighted the impact of those. Interestingly, bears were reported less frequently despite their presence in the landscape. However, the underlying household concerns were very clear. Crop damage and livestock predations were causing economic losses, where wildlife conflict was therefore affecting both safety and livelihood security. At the outcome level, the landscape is all, when we did the analysis and scanning, the landscape was doing relatively well for the wildlife and the habitat, where forests remain healthy, patrolling is active, and wildlife continues to persist. However, people living within this successful landscape, conservation landscapes are carrying much of the cost. Livelihoods and the productive assets were weakest outcomes followed by people's safety. This is central imbalance that the strategy seeks to correct, maintaining strong conservation outcomes while improving the security and resilience of the communities. In terms of partnerships and ownerships, so it is structured around three broad categories. We have the supports of the government, as you can see from the green box, and conservation partners like WWF and local CSOs and medias coming together to partner and champion some of the initiatives within the landscape. At the same time, the core is the community and the locals, where no single institutions can manage human wildlife conflicts. So it's a collective effort where whole different stakeholders and institutions coming together to contribute to human safety. Local government provides coordination while communities provide local knowledge and immediate actions. So that has been the participation as well as ownership at the local level. And in terms of ownership, we engaged about 236 participants from 5 villages, representing approximately about 87% of the household coverage, where women accounted for 47% of the participants, which helped to bring different experience priorities into the discussion. We first shared the assessment results, then communities and duty bearers discussed the problem separately before coming together to agree on our solutions. Finally, responsibilities were assigned to specific stakeholders. Therefore, the results were not simple as a list of requests, but it became a joint own action plans. And to talk about the strategy itself in action, so the first priority is protecting the livelihood, because as I explained earlier, this came as a lowest score from the assessment itself, and it became the first priority to protect the livelihood and productive assets through fencing, alternative livelihoods options, and further eco enterprises solutions. The second is the people's safety, that ensures community know what to do and the trained team can respond quickly and efficiently. Third is the wildlife protections, monitoring, patrolling, which help them to reduce retaliation as well as to provide guided targeted mitigations actions. The last one is maintaining the healthy habitat through the habitat enrichments work, like water hole, native plantation, nurseries, community-based management. And the key message is that coexistence requires progress across all 4 outcomes. If communities remain vulnerable, conservation gains will also remain vulnerable. So that's the key message. We brought it out from this implementation priority against 4 outcomes. On the key actions that we noticed from the pilot implementations, where we prioritize the actions that are directly responded to the most of the urgent needs. For example, like fencing and bioacoustic deterrents help protect the farms. Poultry, seedlings, and breeding bulls responded to the community request for more secure livelihood opportunities. Likewise, rapid response teams improved safety of the coordination and wildlife incidences. In terms of science, Camera trap provided evidences of addressing tiger cattle interactions conflict, where more than 100 joint patrolling strengthened the wildlife protections. So in these four different activities, it is clearly identifying that the need to provide appropriate support and reduce conditions that drive conflict are systematically and well coordinated, provided that they have all the required support from all the required institutions as well as the stakeholders. In terms of enablers, we also noticed that while we invested in the relationship and the capacity needs to sustain these actions, officials were also trained in wildlife handling, then rescue, treatment of community supports, and community representatives visited successful community conflict sites where they brought and practiced and then provided the required support. In terms of safety and awareness, almost all the villages were covered, including schools and other health healthcare sectors were also provided. So taking these examples, all these actions build trust and coordination, the less visible foundation of successful coexistence. So normally these are not quite visible. So these are some of the enablers that really help to leverage the actions that are required on the ground. Like any other approaches and the initiatives, C2C, while we implemented C2C on the ground, we noticed some of the limitations as well as challenges. So if you see on this 6 boxes, so it clearly explains that one thing was we really need to have a proper planning, because when we initiated at that point in time, it coincided with the local national elections, and also we were short constraints of some of the social experts that can really dive about bringing the social elements into it. The planning had also resulted into well-coordinated information, where managing expectations were another challenges. Frequent consultations can also intentionally create expectations that every identified action would be really funded for all the actions. Finally, and approximately about when we design these actions together with all the stakeholders, so about 410 USD funding gap was noted, and this was follow-up assessment where measures for the change in coexistence outcomes could really be to imbalance if we are not able to continue working on that one. So these are some of the challenges that we noted. While we noted some of the challenges, a few lessons that have really resonated with our theory that the Pimki and Nilang just mentioned is the strong the approach that really worked out on the ground. For example, like the co-designing approach, which starts with the community priorities. So basically bringing on board the communities and working together to jointly, design the action as well as owning it together. And for another examples, it's about building that level of confidence and the trust between all the stakeholders, because it shows transparent results, simple visuals, camera traps, patrolling that help community and officials act together in terms of how they coordinate and implement on the ground. So these are some of the lesson learned that we have noted over the period of implementation as well. In terms of impact, while we are not able to ascertain that high-level impact, but since this is work in progress, so the communities, what that really told us about is they really wanted to have a stronger livelihood and better protections of the productive assets. In response, we supported actions like poultry, seedlings, breeding bulls. So where today about 5 kilometers of fencings have been installed, which help them protect about 21 households and about 47 acres of farmland has been used for cultivation. So that has been some of the impacts that we have visibly seen. And in terms of capacity and all those things, 28 officials have been trained, more than about 750 people received awareness supports. So this is clearly indicating that communities, when we engage communities and all the stakeholders, then there is a pathway created for safer livelihoods as well as stronger coexistence on the ground. So in conclusion, I would like to mention that coexistence is not a simply absence of conflict, but it is a situation in which people feel heard, livelihoods are more secured, institutions respond effectively, and wildlife thrives to continue. So the example from Tong clearly shows that when we begin with the community priorities and connect with the conservation actions, we can gradually move from conflict to coexistence. So that's where I would like to end and welcome any questions for the discussions. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you all so much. We already have a couple of questions, and I'd like to start with this one from Gabriella. Is there a way that we can have a collaborative approach even without an overlap?
Femke, do you want me to take that? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the previous question I responded to Mauro, I think that in areas where there may be overlap in a landscape, there may be actual opportunities for collaborative implementation, which is part of the whole, like the stakeholder engagement, meaning everyone who's working there is involved and engaged. So therefore, responsibilities shared for how we implement, how we, support sort of forward momentum on the approach. But also, yes, we can discuss what that means where, implementation on the ground does not overlap as well. And I think that absolutely will be a case-by-case basis on what that looks like. But overall, I will say we are happy to answer any questions or provide any support for folks who are interested in implementing the approach on the ground. So, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But I think what collaboration looks like, especially if there is no immediate overlap on the ground, we can absolutely discuss that and see what that might look like. Femke, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you've captured it well, and it would be really nice to maybe, if anyone is thinking about implementing and wants to have a chat about what it could look like and whether we could collaborate, then please feel free to reach out, and we will share our contact details.
And the other piece I would like to add in terms of implementation, we do have criteria that we've outlined in the material for what you should be thinking about in terms of when you start implementing, what you should have on hand before you implement, that sort of thing. I think it would be great if you would like to take a look at what the material includes, and then we're happy to answer any questions if you'd like to discuss afterwards as well. And also maybe one other thing that I also meant to say is that it is a learning process for us all. The issue itself is dynamic. Our thinking around the issue has changed so much over the years as the issue of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence has changed over time. So along the same lines, we want this approach and learnings and implementation guide to be dynamic as well. So if you are implementing on the ground and you see lessons come up that may not necessarily be in line with the recommendations we've provided in the guidance material for implementation, please let us know, because we would love to include those lessons learned into the next iteration of the step-by-step guide and associated material as we move forward. Currently, the plan is to update this material, especially the step-by-step guide, every year with lessons learned from implementation. So currently we're taking implementation lessons from our pilots, but over time, anyone who is implementing, we welcome you to please provide us your feedback, anything that could be improved, updated. We are more than open to getting all of your input to make sure this approach is impactful for everyone. So yeah, please do get back to us if you have any thoughts and feedback you'd like to provide. Thank you.
That's great. I did have a question on that, so maybe I can ask that of you now. Is there anything that you've heard so far from implementers that is feedback that was maybe surprising, or some example of feedback that you've heard so far of people implementing where it hasn't worked out maybe quite as intended?
Yeah, well, maybe one of the things is that I think especially over the past months, we've been communicating a lot with people implementing the approach that struggle with other approaches that they are implementing at the same time, which requires additional questionnaires or data collection. And sometimes they struggle with combining the different sets of questionnaires when going out into the communities. And some of these communities are already a bit tired of all of these engagements, and sometimes even without any real impact after some of the previous engagements. So there is a bit of a balancing act there. I don't know, maybe Kinley can also speak to that, what your experiences have been, or maybe other things that you have faced while implementing and you thought, oh, this could have been done differently, or maybe we should focus on it when we go back next time.
Okay, thanks, Femke. Just to supplement where Femke left, in our observations, mostly the learning has been in the process itself. Process meaning like the data analysis, the data collections, and all those things. So because when we have this data coming from the analysis, mostly the data were projected in terms of complex spiral graphs, which were quite difficult to understand by the communities, and sometimes quite often it was too puzzling and quite overwhelming for the project leads who lead that entire process. So that has been one key learning that was adopted, and looking forward, I think the entire team is going to make that version quite simpler. Another aspects were in terms of who does what, to coordinating on the ground. So prior to taking this approach on the ground, so they are especially the duty bearers, they wanted to hold back onto their own mandates, taking that traditional territorial rules, not able to come together. So that has really shifted that mindset of working in isolation and coming together. For example, like whenever there is a requirement for the livelihood supports, agriculture and livestock departments could come on board to support how they can leverage some of the technical assistance as well as the local resources that can go in. And likewise, the other technical sectors can chip in, and then and come to a consensus that who does what is made quite clear on the ground, so that ultimately it's the community who take up the ownership at the ground level. So that's how that has been the learning so far.
Wonderful.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on one question that came in. I think it was the question from, I believe it was Estefania in the Q&A. Let me see. I try and figure out where I responded to it, but how long the process should take. I think all of this is entirely context specific and dependent on the local situation, right? The same response that I provided, similar to the response I provided to Hanisi Helava from PNG, which I think how you work with local communities that might be impacted, livelihoods, customary land ownership, etc. Everything is dependent on your specific local context. So how you address the local context for the conflict will depend on what information you get from your baseline assessments on what's going on, and your conversations with stakeholders, the assessments that you do, understanding perceptions, and then you figure out working with your stakeholders on developing measures to address the conflict. So in terms of timing, there's always going to be some external factor that will unwittingly impact your timeline that you have laid out for yourselves. I think Bhutan actually is a really good example. When we started doing steps, the initial steps, we had to wait about 3 or 4 months before we could actually get to the step 4 co-design process, because national elections were happening at that time, and resources from the government were, focused on getting through the election process, which then delayed the whole process of moving from steps 1 through 4 in that time period, right, Kinley? And then it just delayed how we moved forward from there. So I think it entirely depends on your local context, but we expect, in my response, was that at least you could get to small scale implementation and start implementing some measures that have been co-designed within a year or so at the least, which is what we've been seeing in terms of our planning and pilot implementation. So I will add that there. I think we have more questions that have come in as well.
Yeah, I also saw a question on how to introduce approaches that may not be accepted by the communities. And I think the basis of the C2C approach is that it leads to a co-designed human-wildlife conflict management approach that everyone is happy with. So it should be, the intervention should actually be coming from the communities. It should not be put on them. So if you know what I mean, we are not there to say you should be herding your livestock in a certain way. Then the question is, how would they want to protect their livestock in a way that is culturally appropriate? Given, of course, the context in terms of legislative approaches, the financial situation, anything, how would they want to move forward? So I think that is more important. And then also to go back to the question of Hanisi, and that is something I don't know if maybe Kinley can also speak to it. I also understood the question a bit like how can the C2C approach maybe be used for the protection of species which may not be in direct conflict with people, as it is speaking about certain frog species. And of course, there are issues there related to livelihoods and customary land ownership and things like that, and development pressures. My understanding is, and I think that you can apply the C2C approach for any conservation issue. Only the questionnaires are very much focused on conflict-related issues where wildlife is posing a direct threat to people, for example. But of course, you could reorganize the questions and speak to people and work with people on the co-design of a conflict or of a conservation management approach through co-design. And that is actually the same approach, only for a different purpose. And I don't know, Kinley, have you come across any ideas like that while working on the implementation of the C2C approach for using a similar method for other conservation challenges?
Yes, FMK, we do have. So just to set a context here and give a little bit background. So when we did the assessment, and some of the assessment clearly said that while the habitat and the wildlife came out, some of the were quite doing well, it doesn't mean that we should not be concentrating or forgetting the actions required against those outcomes. So basically, I wanted to say that when we try to do the livelihood as well as the people safety and other actions simultaneously, this set of data really gives an overview to inform the park authorities or forest offices to set a strategic approach in terms of where their species are and what kind of habitat are there being affected. So if the habitats are being degraded, it gives an opportunity for the park authorities or forest divisions to make some of the decisions to allocate resources to improve the habitat so that wildlife doesn't come out of the forest and go to the villages in search of food and all those things. So these are some of the trigger factors that could be leading to conflict and going back to the villages. So if we improve the habitat in the forest, then likely wildlife might stay in the forest. Likewise, The second, if we have this ranking of the conflict species, then it gives a holistic management, how we approach and prioritize the conservation actions that are required to do some proper species protections. For example, if a site says that the tigers are being coming to the villages or being approached heavily, then that data can inform the park authorities to give a proper and more protections in terms of the actions on the ground. So these are some of the examples that we have noted through this approach, where some of the species related works are also being carried out simultaneously.
That's an excellent example. I have one other question maybe before we end. Nalanga, you typed out an answer, but Kunle, something that you just said about a holistic approach made me think that we should maybe talk about this answer a little bit. The question was around legal regulation, policy, education, and stakeholder engagement. And then
Yep.
Nalanga, your answer that you typed out was that policy is a key element, and awareness and education go in there too. But maybe we could just talk about that a little bit as we sort of wrap up and really think about it as this holistic approach.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Megan. And I think it's something to highlight for sure. It's one of the areas that we haven't explored that much to date in terms of like what policies exist, what are the gaps, what we could advocate for. The policies that we know mostly that exist are around things like compensation schemes, right? Often government mandated managed compensation schemes exist to buffer losses to communities that may incur losses from conflicts related especially or specifically to endangered or protected species, right? But there are many other policy intervention areas that could be relevant and things that can be improved. One example I will provide is that in a number of countries, often communities feel disenfranchised with government responses to human wildlife conflicts, where the wildlife agency, perhaps, that is mandated with managing the wildlife or protecting the wildlife or addressing injuries or things as a result of potential conflicts, respond much faster to those situations than people that might have the mandate to respond to the human impacts from those conflicts, for instance. So there is a perception or understanding among communities that the government cares more about wildlife than they do about people. Perhaps there could be policies that can be advocated for, where faster responses to the human side of the conflict impacts can also be mandated to relevant authorities like the police or other agencies that are mandated to respond to things like this. So that could be a policy angle that we look at. We're currently working with some colleagues to identify some of these policy gaps and recommendations, which eventually we hope to include as a tool on C2C with all the other tools that are available on the website, so that nationally folks can take those overarching policy recommendations and tailor them for their local context as relevant and use them as advocacy sort of prompts to move policy advocacy forward, so that you're strengthening management of conflict from that very government level, where there is deep buy-in from the government also to help support improved human wildlife conflict management on the ground. So that's the policy piece I wanted to add.
Amazing. Well, I don't know if we'll send out the recording and the resources, and we'll also include your contact information so people can contact you or the team if that's okay with you all. And we are at our time for today, but thank you all so much for joining us and being so engaged with all of your wonderful questions. I do hope you reach out to the team here and provide some feedback around your own coexistence, work, and also feedback on if you start using the C2C framework and how that looks for you as well. Any closing thoughts from our wonderful speakers today?
We really appreciate the opportunity to share. And as I mentioned, we are looking to learn. We're constantly learning. We look to learn from everybody who's thinking of implementing. So really appreciate everyone participating today.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. We will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.